Hello everybody, welcome back to Valley of the Mist Block of the Month. I'm Adriane Ritter.
And I'm Shelley McNeely.
And we're here with the May 2021 Block of the Month. Remember that the instructions for this block are on the Valley of the Mist Quilt Guild's website under the Block of the Month. And they're definitely helpful when you're going along. So this block this month is one called Friendship. And I want to just talk about it a little bit. The idea is that you've got these four friends, and this unites them in friendship.
Okay.
Right?
Yes.
I think that's the idea.
Yeah.
Okay, so, and I'll tell you, we did try making this as one big block, and it's a pretty block. But for Block of the Month, we decided making four little ones kind of worked better. If you're making a whole quilt, you definitely could do it just as big 12-inch blocks.
Right.
Okay, so Shelley, what fabrics do we need?
Okay, so for this year, you're getting your own fabrics, but we still need what we have been using, a focus fabric. That's like this one, and a fabric that coordinates with that, so this one would be my greenish fabric. And then we need two neutrals, one light and one dark. It could be black and white, or white and gray, or an off-white and a brown. So you can pick whatever you want there. Okay, so now for this particular block, we're going to need 16 4-inch squares. And 8 of those are going to be of one color, and 2 colors you're going to make 4 each.
So that's 3 of your 4 fabrics.
Right.
And then the last fabric.
You're going to need a piece that is about 90 inches long if you try to do a long piece, or however long you can do it. And that should be between 3/4 of an inch and 1/4 inches wide. And then what that kind of breaks down to is 16 pieces that are at least 6 inches long if you cutting individual pieces.
Right. And you can if you don't have scraps that you can use, then you can just cut strips and strip piece this. If you do have scraps, then that's where the 6 inches you need. That's probably the minimum you need.
Okay. They don't all have to be the same width.
Yeah. And I like this narrow look. Pretty small. They're not all the same. So the first thing you need to do is these 4-inch squares that we start with, you're going to take them and you're going to, they're already cut so I can't show you, but we want you to press them on the diagonal. Now, if you're going to use a ruler to make your cuts, you only need to press on one diagonal. If you like to cut without using a ruler, then I suggest you make a press on both diagonals and use that line, that one of the diagonals, as a guide, because we want you to make a cut that's about 3/8 of an inch away from one diagonal. So you end up with a kind of a big triangle and a small triangle. And then what we need you to do next, after you've made those cuts, is you're going to take your 4th fabric, the strips, and you're going to sew the big triangle to this fabric along that cut that you just made. So you're going to sew all of those on there, cut them apart, or if they're separate pieces, and then we want you to press them. And Shelley and I did our pressing different on this block, but you can press the seams open, which is what Shelley did,
right,
because you end up with, as you can see from here, you're going to have 2 seams very close together. Or you definitely can't, there's not enough room to, unless you use, if you use the 1 1/4 inch size,
the
there's
1 inch.
barely enough room to get both seams together.
Yeah.
But if you're doing a smaller piece, you can't full press them to that strip. So even though this is a white fabric and light, I ended up having to press towards the white on one side. So Shelley's like, I press it open so only her white shows behind it. But I pressed them to one direction, and I alternated. I considered my whites to be a light, and I pressed them one way, and all my other ones I pressed the other way, because I'm doing 8 of white in this one. And that one I did 8 of gray, and I considered that my dark, and I pressed all those one way and the others the other. Okay, blah, blah, blah.
I know.
Anyway, so.
Oh, there's pictures, if you go to the written instructions, so it might be a little bit
Well, I
less
don't want to
confusing.
talk about pressing. on
No,
those,
but
yeah.
it might be, there's pictures showing things.
Right.
Though.
Anyway, so you're going to sew that on, and then you're going to press these, and then you're going to take the other small triangle, and that's what your diagonal pressing is for. You're going to, the tip of that, you're going to line up with the pressed mark, and then the other end you're going to, line it up with that other side of the strip. And you're
That just helps you get it in the center.
in the center, okay? And then sew that on, and you'll end up with a piece that miraculously looks something like this. So it's a little square that's not trimmed. It's kind of oversized. So now this step, if you are very comfortable with your 1/4 inch seam, you never find your blocks ending up a little bit small or whatever, you can trim these now down to 3.5 inches. But what we're recommending is you just trim on here the inside seam of these. So it's the seam that goes around the small triangle. And on my square up ruler, so Shelley and I don't really recommend that many things, but a 6.5 inch ruler, 6.5 inch square inch ruler is pretty convenient for our block of the month blocks, because that's a 1/4 of the block, and then the 12.5 inch ruler. And on this ruler, I have a line that I'm at the 3.5 inch mark here. The ones are both up here at the 3.5 inch mark here, and I just put a strip across here. It's a little bit hard to say. It's a really tiny line, but you could do it with blue painter's tape or whatever. And I use that. I didn't share that with Shelley at first, but anyway, I used that as a guide, and I kind of lined up my it doesn't have to actually hit it, but you can kind of line it up with it and make sure my block is going to be at least 3.5 inches, and I trim off these 2 sides. Okay? So we want you to do that now, and then we'll be back and we will have our 16 sub block. Okay, so at this point you should have all of your little blocks back into squarish.
Right.
Squarish, because they're not all trimmed up.
Yeah.
Okay, so the outsides are not trimmed, maybe.
Whoops.
Oh, did one of yours fall off? Okay.
I know.
Okay, so now at this point, you really should have kind of thought about this at the beginning when we were deciding which colors you were going to have 8 of versus 4 of.
Right.
But obviously the block looks designed. We had 2 opposite. You can arrange them how you want.
Right.
They don't have to be 2 opposite. They can be
as far as I've planned mine is the individual blocks.
Right, because you could lay out the whole 16, and maybe you want, and on this one, they're opposite, but you could have 4 concentrated there. There's a lot of options of how you do this.
We'll come back for that part.
Final look.
Yeah.
So what you need to do is decide how these are going to go. I keep doing mine symmetrical. I lay all 4 out the same.
Yeah, I have 2.
On the test one, I might have done something different, but on these, I've done them the same.
Okay.
Okay, so at this point now, we're going to talk about pressing in just a second, but you're going to put these arrange them to sew 4 patches. So you're going to sew 2 and 2 together, and then sew that center seam and press it. And
Right.
we're going to come back.
And you'll have 4 pieces then. 4 squares.
No, we can talk about that now. All right, we'll keep
Okay.
going. Okay, we're going to keep going. Okay, so Shelley wanted to talk about the pressing once you get
The 4.
the 4 sewn together. Now, this is like I talked before. Here's one of my 4 patches sewn together. On my individual little squares, I pressed my whites were my light and the other 2 were my darks, and I pressed one of them towards the small triangle, the lights, and the dark I pressed to the large triangle. And so on the back, to me, I had 2 pieces of fabric, and they kind of locked together, and I was happy with that. Now Shelley did a different
Yeah,
process.
I pressed mine open, so they didn't lock, but they lined up. I could still
One
get them
edge,
to line
one
up.
edge kind of lined up. Because if your strip is not exactly
Oh,
straight,
right.
or it's a different width, they're
That's
not
true.
going to totally
That's
line
true.
up.
That's true. Mine, I cut mine all the same size. So.
Yeah, and you can see on this
Yeah.
this one laying down here, I definitely had different widths. Like
And
this
actually,
is narrower.
probably mine weren't perfectly the same, but yeah, you're right.
Because they don't need to be.
Right, right.
And it's great for using up scrap pieces.
Right. So then, it's normal 4-patch how to press them. I really only had one light, so it kind of worked out fine when I pressed these seams. So
Right. Okay, so once you get these 4 together, we're gonna move on here and actually include the next step right now. So you're gonna sew this into a 4-patch, which is gonna look something like this. Okay, so you'll end up with 4 of these, and these, I definitely would suggest you play with turning them, looking at different patterns. They make a different look depending on how you put them together. In this one, when I laid the 4 together, I kind of had the whites down this and the blues over.
well,
Well, yeah, well, kind of, but the whites stayed in the center.
Yeah.
And I did another one, well, my test one, and I had it different. So you can get a different. It's a slight variation in the look, but do what pleases you.
Yeah,
that's what matters.
Right.
So to do that, just like we did with these little blocks where we only squared up that inner edge, with these 6.5-inch blocks, we only want, after you figure out your layout, square up the 2 sides you're going to sew. And when you, after you do that, you're going to line up, like if this is a squared up, say I squared up this corner, and I squared up this corner, that's where I'm going to start from. I'm going to sew there. And so the outer edges aren't going to match perfectly when you sew it because you haven't trimmed them to the right size.
But this is confusing. Trim them up to 6.5.
Yeah, you can trim them up to 6.5. But we like to leave extra because there's so many times we do a block and we think we want it to look symmetrical like this, but then at the end we lay our ruler on it and we decide we want to make it kind of wonky.
Yeah. So
and if you trim them up even, you're not going to have anything to make it wonky if you want to.
Right.
So we just want to leave that option once you sew it. So,
but you should trim two sides.
2 edges at least.
Yeah. Otherwise, I mean, you still get something, but you'll lose
right.
stuff on the outer.
And those
if you don't.
obviously, because it's a size we use all the time, we forget to mention it. Those trim to 6.5.
Right.
After you put the 4 pieces together. So 3.5 to 6.5 to 12.5.
Right.
And that half, obviously, I mean, not trying to beat a dead horse, but you lose that 1/2 inch when you put 2 seams together.
Right.
Okay, so step 1, arrange your 4 patches and sew those together, and then arrange your 4 patches for your final block look. And we'll be back with our finished blocks. All right, so here's our finished blocks. Right. Now, I've squared mine up.
I haven't.
Shelley hasn't, but it's it's really fun because, I did a test block with some other fabrics, and but seeing it with your fabrics,
right.
and what we're really excited about is how different they look depending on your choices of what we call your dominant fabric, or which on this one were my whites and on this one were grays.
Yeah, I know.
Shelley, it was her teal color.
Right.
And then how you then ultimately arrange those makes a different look. So Shelley and I both went to putting 4 together, but it wasn't my dominant fabric, and Shelley it was.
Yeah.
And so you can see they all look so different. So
right.
Definitely play with your arrangement, right. And find a look that you really like, or make a bunch. Whatever.
I know. Yeah. This would kind of really make a cool quilt, I think.
Right. And actually, Shelley's talking about maybe making a quilt with the a mix of these with the 4-patch, the smaller block size, and a big one.
Right.
And
I
doing
think
something
would be
like that.
very interesting. Yeah.
All right, so that's it for the May block of the
Right.
month. We will see you next month, and
Have fun.
yeah, have fun.